Good morning, everyone. Happy Hanukkah on this snowy seventh day of Hanukkah. Oops. We are in Mishna Meiser Sheni. Excuse me. Perek Gimel, chapter 3, Mishnah Gimel, Mishnah 3. Mi shayiloi mais b'Yerushalayim. A person who had Meiser Sheni money in Yerushalayim, v'tzarech lehem, but he needs to use them for purposes that he would not be allowed to use Meiser Sheni money for. You know, Meiser Sheni money can be used for food, for drink, for smearing something on your body, but for other things you can't use it. But you need this Meiser Sheni money for something else. Your friend has fruits, regular chulin fruits. They're not Meiser Sheni fruits, regular chulin fruits. You can say to your friend, a person says to his friend, this money, the sanctity of Meiser Sheni is transferring this money onto your fruits. Of course, he has to consent. Of course, he has to agree to it. If he agrees to it, you can do that. You can transfer the sanctity from your money onto that person's fruits, of course, if he gives you permission. Nimtzar comes out, that the person now who owned the fruits must eat the fruits in a state of purity because they have now gained the sanctity of Meiser Sheni. So they have to be treated accordingly, which means you can't eat them if you are tamei, if you're impure. You also have to eat in Yerushalayim, which is the case here. You're in Yerushalayim. You got to make sure that you eat in Yerushalayim. The halah and the other person, meaning the person who had the money, can do whatever he wants with his money because the sanctity of Meiser Sheni has been transferred off of it. Nonetheless, there's an exception to this rule. The exception is that you cannot say so to an ignorant person, except we're talking about demai. What that means is like this. The first thing the Mishnah says is you can't say this to an Amoritz. A person who is considered ignorant is a person who we are concerned that they will not treat Meiser Sheni appropriately. If they are considered ignorant, if they are ignorant, then they're not going to be careful. They're not knowledgeable and careful enough with the laws of purity and impurity. And therefore, we are concerned that if you transfer the sanctity of your coins onto the Amoritz, onto the ignorant person's fruits, thus putting the sanctity of the Meiser Sheni on his fruits, he's not going to treat them properly. He's not going to be careful to make sure not to eat them in a state of tumah. And therefore, we say that this option is not an option that you should do with an Amoritz. However, there's an exception even to that, and that is what's called demai. In a case of demai. Now, demai means that we had Masechta Demai a while ago. But that's a law that says that if you buy grain from an Amoritz, from an ignorant person, then the problem is that there were some ignorant people who did not separate Meisers. Everybody, there was no question, separated Truma for the Kohen. When it came to the Meiser, the tithings, to the Levi, the Meiser Sheni, these were things that there were some of them who were not observant of. They just didn't think it was important enough to do for some reason. Now, the majority of them did, but a minority of them didn't. And even though there was a minority of them, which would really mean that according to Torah law, you wouldn't have to suspect that when you're buying from an Amoritz, from an ignorant person, that his grain hasn't been tithed. Nonetheless, the Chachamim had a stringency to say that if you're buying from an Amoritz, you have to tithe it over again because of that minority of Amoritz, of ignorant people who don't take off Meisers. So whenever you buy from an Amoritz, you have to separate Shumas and Meisers. That means the Meiser that goes to the Levi. That means the Meiser Sheni that we're talking about right now. Now, because of the fact that it's the Mai, meaning, as I explained, it's rabbinic stringency. Again, it's a rabbinic law, but it was based on a stringency because of the minority of ignorant people who don't separate Meisers. Therefore, we find leniencies when it comes to Meiser of the Mai that we wouldn't have by regular Meiser. So now in our case, we're talking about like this, or the exception to the rule to be able to do this with an Amoritz. You bought grain from a Amoritz. You had to separate, that was the Mai. You had to separate Meiser Sheni because it was the Mai. you have to treat it like any other Meiser Sheni. You have to take it to Yerushalayim, or you have to redeem it onto money. That's what we're talking about here, or in this part of the Mishnah. The money if the money was money that got a sanctity of Meiser Sheni, for Meiser Sheni of Demai, then we can be lenient with that money and do what the Mishnah says here of transferring the sanctity of the money onto his fruit. Being that it's Demai, being that therefore it has leniency, therefore it's more lenient. Here, in the case of the money of Demai, that you want to transfer it onto the fruits of the Amaretz, we were not stringent and we said you could do so. It's okay, so let's put it all together. A person can go over to his friend and say, I have my Meiser Sheni money. I want to be able to spend it on whatever I want. Can I transfer the sanctity of the Meiser Sheni onto your fruit? Can I be machalal it onto your fruit? And he says, sure. All right, it's done. Now, number one, it comes out at the end, as the Mishnah says, that the person who owned the fruit has to treat his fruit like Meiser Sheni. The original person can treat his money like regular money, which is an interesting law that's being taught, and that is that although this started off as your Meiser Sheni produce, that you transferred the sanctity onto money, and at the end of the day, you're not even going to be using that, you're not even going to be spending that money, which means you never actually partook of your Meiser Sheni. Mishnah still says that's okay as long as it's going to be eaten and eaten properly. So you go and give it to your friend who can be trusted. He's going to treat that fruit now with the sanctity of Meiser Sheni. You can do it to him. The Mishnah says, but don't do it to an Amaretz. Don't do it to an Amaretz. Because when you transfer the money onto the Amaretz, onto the ignorant person's produce, we're afraid that because he's an Amaretz and he's not careful with the laws of purity and impurity, that he's not going to make sure to eat this fruit that now has the sanctity of Meiser Sheni in a state of purity. So don't do it with him. Unless we're talking about a case where your original Meiser Sheni produce that you transferred its sanctity onto the coins was Demai. It was bought from an ignorant person who there's a rabbinic law to separate Meiseris because we have to suspect that perhaps he didn't. But because it's Demai, and therefore there are leniencies in Demai, if we're talking about Meiser Sheni money from Demai, then you can transfer the sanctity of that Meiser Sheni money onto the fruits of the Amaretz, and we're not going to be so concerned about perhaps he won't eat them in a state of purity, since it is the money. Okay. Okay, so we're going to go through two halachas, two laws here today. They're a continuation. So we have been saying that if you have witnessed a person who has done something wrong, you saw it, you know that he did something wrong, still, that doesn't necessarily give you permission to go ahead and say it over to other people. However, this breaks down into different details. The imhu ish beinani, kastam ish Yisrael, if we're talking about a regular person who typically guards himself from sin, and sometimes he stumbles, and he gives in to his temptations. So now you saw him do something that's wrong. But you would be able, but again, he's a Beinani, he's a middle-of-the-road person, he's typically a person who doesn't sin. Middle of the road, typical, it's called typical person who doesn't sin. Not a tzaddik, not a righteous person, but a regular Jew, person who we assume wants to keep Torah mitzvahs. And we could say that although what he did was wrong, we could say he did it without realizing. He didn't realize. Maybe he didn't know it's forbidden. Or he thought this was some kind of astringency or a good trait that people that very careful people, that scrupulous people are careful of, which means he doesn't really know that it's that serious. I mean, there are certain things like that. I mean, Lashon Harah would probably be one of them, that people just don't take it as serious. They don't just, you tell them it's forbidden. I understand it's forbidden, but they just don't take it that serious. It's just the way it is. And a lot of times it's because of ignorance. Even if you've seen this person do it many times, you definitely should, therefore, assume it's based on that. The person didn't realize, the person doesn't know that you can't do this on Shabbos. A lot of laws to the laws of Shabbos. Possibly doesn't know. He didn't even realize what he was doing. If you could say that's the basis of it, even if you did it many times, you should continue to assume but that's why he's doing it. And you certainly shouldn't then go to reveal it to other person, so they shouldn't be put down in the eyes of people. And don't look down on him even in your own eyes. And it's forbidden to hate him for it. This is also called giving the person the benefit of the doubt. But according to many opinions, even in these circumstances, you have a positive commandment of give the person the benefit of the doubt. Although he's doing something wrong, right? It's not like before, 50-50. You could judge it one way, judge the other way. He did something wrong, but you can go ahead and say that he's doing it unknowingly, unwittingly. He doesn't realize it's really that wrong. That's what you should do in your own mind. Forget about the Lashon Harah. That for sure you shouldn't go ahead and say it over to other people. But in your own mind, you should be giving this person the benefit of the doubt. Aval, however, im yira lahen shachayte yadas etzem isurei. But if, let's say, it's clear that he knows what he did was wrong. And he did it intentionally. He did an illicit act that everybody knows you're not allowed to do. He ate something not kosher that everybody knows isn't kosher. Again, for someone who would know that. That typically people know that it's forbidden. Again, you could have situations where they don't know it's forbidden. But again, a situation where you know it's the kind of person who knows what exactly he's doing. Couldn't be otherwise. Totally bezeh. Can depend on this. And again, this is a person who typically watches himself from sinning. And now you see that he gave in to a temptation one time in private. You're not allowed to reveal to other people. Even not in front of him. But one who does reveal it, that you've done a very terrible thing. You will bear your guilt for that. Perhaps this person already has had Harah, regret for what he did. Serious regret. But because of that, he's already forgiven by God. The main component of repentance is a level of regret that you have. Now he told the people what he did. He'll now be looked down terribly by them. Even though it's already after he regretted what he did. And he's been forgiven. Therefore, the cruel person who now reveals this has done a terrible sin. This should not even be revealed to the judges of the city, even if there be a second witness to establish this. We know that to establish something in a court of Jewish law, you have to have two witnesses. Because if you don't have two witnesses, you can't reveal that anyway. The judges may not accept what you say. And they should just look at you as someone who's is a gospel, somebody who speaks Lashon Harah. But even in a case where you have two people witness this, so you have legitimate witnesses, what gain is there from it? What's the point of going to the judges? What's the gain? What are they going to do? Because he only did it once. He only did it once. And what are they going to call him in? What are they going to do to him? Rather, you have to go over and rebuke the person. Privately, because of the fact that he's rebelled against Hashem with his sin. And he should make sure to create fences. He should create precautionary measures to make sure that he doesn't stumble again. So he doesn't sin again. and the person who is giving the rebuke should be very careful to speak softly, so as not to embarrass him. The Torah says, rebuke your friend and don't bear a sin. Don't get a sin for it. Rashi says, what does that mean? Even if privately you rebuke somebody, but you really lay it into them so they're embarrassed in front of you, that's forbidden to do. So therefore, when you are rebuking this person, what they did, you have to do it in a way so as not to make him feel embarrassed even from you. This again, we're talking about even a person who is a Beinani. He's a regular person when it comes to other matters. Clearly now he sinned, but otherwise he tries not to sin. Let's say you're talking about a person who's a well-known Torah scholar and God-fearing person. But somehow or another, his evil inclination got the best of him, and he gave, and he fell, and he gave in. It's clearly it'd be a terrible sin to publicize what he did. Not even out of think in your mind, question him in your mind. By that person, you have to assume he for sure did tshuva. Meaning by the regular person, right, you don't speak Lashon Hara because maybe he did tshuva. If you're talking about a God-fearing person who unfortunately stumbled, who fell, that's the person you have to assume in your own mind that he for sure did tshuva. He for sure repented and regretted what he did. Even if now his evil inclination overcame him once, his soul is bitter over it. And he's terribly frightened for the responsibility of his guilt. Chazal, as our sages say, if you've seen a Torah scholar who has committed a sin at night, don't have questionable thoughts about him the next day. Because that's the person for sure you have to assume has repented. So the first step here, or the first two steps, is that in the case where you have seen him do something wrong, and we say that you cannot go ahead and publicize it, even though you saw him do something wrong. It's not a question. He did something wrong. So we say like this. If we're talking about a vanity, talking about a person who typically tries to stay away from sin, and you could possibly say that this sin that he committed, he did it without realizing it, without knowing that it was wrong, without understanding the seriousness of it, but understanding that it's truly a sin, you have to give that person the benefit of doubt. And in your own mind, you shouldn't look down at him. For sure not speak Lashon Hara. But let's say we're talking about this person who did something that is unquestionable. It's not something you do unintentional, and it's not something that you didn't know about. So clearly he did something wrong. So then again, if we're talking about the regular person, the person who typically tries to stay away from sin, here he clearly didn't. But other times we know that he does. And he did it once, and he did it privately. So again, then you have to again consider the possibility that he regrets what he did. He has been forgiven, and of course you cannot reveal it to anyone, even according to even to a bezin, even to a Jewish court of law. But rather, what you do is you speak to the person and help him out, help him not to sin again. And this is by a person who is a vanity, by the person who we say typically he tries. Sometimes he sins, sometimes he doesn't. He tries not to. Even this person, you have to consider the possibility that he has regretted, and therefore, of course, you can't tell it to other people. But if we're talking about a Talmid Chacham, a Yirei Shemayim, we're talking about a person who's a well-established Torah scholar, well-established God-fearing person. For that person who has unfortunately stumbled terribly right now, and again, only did it once, that person you have to for sure assume that he has repented. Okay, so this is where we're up to. You could already, get the feeling that we're leading up into another stage, into later stages, because we're talking about the person who can assume didn't realize. That's the first thing. He didn't realize, or even if he does realize, he only did it once. It's not something that he doesn't care about, like he just has basically thrown off, observance of this mitzvah. Unfortunately, he gave into his temptation. And he's the kind of person that we can assume would regret what he did. Then we have to consider that and try to help him out. But what happens if you're talking about a person who basically is doing these kinds of sins and he doesn't care? It doesn't matter to him anymore. That will be the next level, the next detail of the discussion. Have a wonderful day. Happy Hanukkah, and stay safe, and hope you deal well with the snow.